All right, we're going to get started, y'all. We're going to get started. All right, this is the Advanced PMC lecture. Does everyone know what PMC stands for? Just kidding, that's basic. Fuck basic. We are advanced. And that's what this lecture is going to be, is advanced as we can. It's not going to be that advanced. I used this exact joke in the Advanced K lecture yesterday. And it's true, it will be semi-advanced. And I think we're going to dispense with most of the very basics of just what your advantages are and what everything is, and we're going to be going the step beyond that. And how do you use those things strategically and advantageously to you? Also, yesterday I gave a speech where I was talking about this is in my mind, every single speech that you're trying to say. How do I give this speech better? You do so by asking yourself two questions, which are, what is my end game? What's the strategic goal that I have for this speech? I think it's simple, but it's remarkably important in your head for you to have defined your goal. Far too much time with the PMC is spent on arguments that are almost certainly just not going to be that impactful in a judge's mind at the end of it. So it's always good to have that in mind of what is it about what I'm doing right now that's going to help me win the round? How do I best organize this speech in such a way as to facilitate that?
Can you talk about balancing that, like trying to cut down some of the stuff that's not going to be really impactful versus if you don't cover it enough, then the other team's going to be like, well, you didn't do this.
I mean, I think it's on something where you're obviously topical, you don't need to be spending a lot of time giving definitions. On something so you have to be able to pick and choose based on what's happening in the round. If you're questionably topical and you're trying to, tell people, you're trying to act as if you're topical, but you might be worried about losing on that level of the debate, there's probably more time that needs to be spent doing that on that level. So it is, in many ways, you have to be reactive to the situation as it comes to you. But I think that as we go through, it'll be kind of clear the things I think that you should be prioritizing and not prioritizing. The second main question, other than what's your end game, what are the unique characteristics or traits of the speech? So, what is it about the speech, and what characteristics does it have, and how does its place and function in the course of the debate round change how one might argue? Those are the two questions you should always be asking. So let's ask those about the PMC now. I think we're going to start with that second question first. Of what are the unique characteristic or traits of the Prime Minister Constructive? Klaus, name me one.
Well, it should be clear.
No, not the structural features of how is that different than any of the other speeches?
Oh, it's like, how is the PMC different than every other? It's just a speech where it's straight offense. Like, you're able to, you're basically reading something uncontested, which means that all of your claims are just kind of laid out there. So it's all offense.
There's zero responding in the Prime Minister's speech, right? Every other speech will almost certainly, you will have to be responding and taking into account other arguments, but there is not specifically an argument you are responding to, obviously, because you are giving the first speech of the round. So that is a unique characteristic. Another one, Erwig, unique characteristic of the PMC.
Maybe about the time.
I mean, 7 No, how much time you have to prepare.
Oh, you're 20 minutes.
You've guaranteed prep time, 20 minutes. That is the biggest thing about the PMC, guaranteed 20 minutes of prep time. Which means not only that you have time to write your arguments more, but this is the most important part, is you have time to be thinking not just, here's why our argument's good, but, so if we say this, they're probably gonna come back with this, and how do we respond to that? And taking each thing a step or two down the line and being able to say, well, they're probably gonna say this, and knowing that, and so utilizing prep time to run through the different iterations of possibilities that the debate could take, and saying, well, if we're running this, we probably are gonna link to an econ advantage. That's probably a true thing, if we're doing this big regulation. If our affirmative is to regulate the hell out of something, there's probably gonna be an econ disad that people are going to be running against us. So since you know that, you're able to not just write all your AF about, here's why we help the environment, here's why that's such a good thing, here's why that's such a good thing. You need to be writing, here's why our AF helps the environment, and preempting and trying to outweigh the expected econ disadvantage that's going to be coming. So even though you aren't responding, there's no disad that you have on their uniqueness. They first say this, I'm going to respond with this. That's not there, but you do know that there are certain things that are probably going to be, if you're helping the environment by doing all these regulations on business, it's going to be environment versus the economy. Let's try and outweigh that in some way. Let's try and come up with an argument about why helping the environment helps the economy, and so to turn it or something like that. So because you have that 20 minutes of guaranteed prep, you are able to have you're gonna distract me. No. It's okay. That will totally distract me though. Nothing against you. I'm a distractible man. That was actually my AIM screen name growing up. Distractible man. But no. So you've got this 20 minutes of guaranteed prep, and not only should your arguments be more thorough because you're the only one who is guaranteed linking them to the plan text. What you know what your plan text is, and so you're the one who's spending prep time. The only time anyone's prepping, you're the only one who is guaranteed saying, well, we can base our links off of this plan text, because the neg doesn't really know exactly what you're going to be running. When you're responding to arguments later in the debate, you don't know what the counter plan text is going to be, so your responses to it aren't going to be responsive to that. There's always going to be, this is the speech that allows you to most closely and specifically tailor the arguments you're going for exactly to the plan text. And so this has a couple important beneficial aspects to it. The first one is that it means that not only are you able to tailor your arguments to the plan text, but you're also, the reverse of that, the other side of that coin, is you're able to tailor it away from certain things that might link. So if you're worried about an econ disadvantage, maybe you can structure your plan text in a certain way that will only affect one part, so maybe not affect that econ as much or something. And so I don't have an example off the top of my head, but it's able to craft a plan text to likely to try and link out of potential expected opposition strategies that might be coming. Okay. That was a little, I think it's important to keep those things in mind of you got the guaranteed prep, there's no explicit responding, though there is preemption of expected arguments. The next question, that first one up there, is what's your end game? What is your strategic goal? Obviously, on a very basic level, the question is you're trying to prove why the plan is a good idea. And obvious. But again, we're not basic, are we? We are advanced. And so it's not just. So what I think a big part of this lecture is going to focus on is making is the good versus better distinction. I think far too often PMCs are about why the plan is a good idea, which is necessary. You need to be proving that it's a good idea. But at the end of the debate, that is not the judge's decision. The judge is not deciding whether plan is a good idea. The judge is deciding whether the plan is better than whatever the negative team is advocating. If that's the status quo, is plan better than the status quo? If that's a counter plan, is plan better than the counter plan? If that's whatever it may be, is plan better than what they're advocating? If you're proving that plan's a good idea, if that's all you're trying to do, if you're arguing against a team that's doing the status quo, that might be enough. It might be enough to just say, hey, plan's a good idea. They're only advocating the status quo. We have this positive, beneficial benefit to us. That's all we need to do. It's just not a relevant question if there's a counter plan which has changed that that frame of reference. It's not that it's not whether plan is a good idea. It is whether the plan is a better idea than the counter plan. I'd say probably 60 to 70% of the rounds you're going to see are going to have a counter plan in them. If that's the case, if you're seeing counter plans that often, that means that on all of those instances, proving that the plan is a good idea is not the most relevant question to you at the end of the day. Proving that the plan is a better idea than the counter plan is the most relevant question at the end of the day. So knowing that, that's why preemption becomes so important in the course of the round, because 60 to 70% of the time it's going to be a counter plan that is the important part of it. So a little bit later we're going to be talking about and going through some examples of ways in which you can do that, the type of preemption that can occur. Because that's going to be the main part of this. I want to go through in other ways of what we can try and be doing with the PMC, what are the strategic actions we can take. So I'll go through a list of those, and then we'll kind of examine all of those in example to allow for more detail. Okay. So the second main strategic goal of the PMC is that you need to make it difficult, or to make it difficult for the negative to access the arguments they want to be running. So, this can be done through a framework, which if you're worried you might be hitting a team that's a critique team, you can be running framework arguments at the top of case that are disads to a critique framework, that are why critical education and why doing things in such a way would be a bad thing. If you are... There was a team a few years ago who had this whole thing about how we should prioritize disads that are... The way they phrased it was more intrinsic to the affirmative, but it was basically just trying to make it hard for people to run politics, like, at the end of the day. Their framework was something about prioritize intrinsic disads, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, the function of this argument was they wanted to say, hey, politics disads aren't related to the germane question at hand posed by the resolution. They're kind of out there on their own, so they're bad. That was what they were trying to do out of it. And it was a remarkably successful strategy for them because they were able to, that was so many teams' go-to, and they weren't used to having to defend their ability to answer that argument, right? They would go into it expecting that they can run this disad. they raised that question in the debate, and they made, so the negative going into the debate had a strategy. We're going to have this counter plan, we're going to have a politics disad, and we're going to try something else. But now they have to spend 45 seconds answering 45 seconds of arguments about why this type of disadvantage is a bad thing. So it's adding the that time that the negative has to spend in order to even begin to start to weigh what they expected to be their main piece of offense in the round. We talked earlier, remember, about how that there's no responding, it's only making your own arguments. One of the benefits of that is that the PMC tends to have more time. They're not time crunched very much at all because there's no need for them to spend a whole hell of a lot of time answering other arguments. You're only making your own. So because of that, you're able to devote things like 30 or 45 seconds to politics disad's bad or something at the top of case. And because you're able to do that, the LOC is a significantly more time crunch speech than the PMC. They have to be making all their arguments, answering case, doing all those things. So that's saying, hey, here's 30, 45 seconds that I don't feel I really need to utilize in my PMC in order to make the advantages I want. So I'm utilizing that, not a big cost to me. Even if they only have to spend the exact same time answering it, that 30 to 45 seconds is significantly more valuable than it is to you as an LOC. And so it's putting your opponent in a difficult position. I think that this isn't something I would do every round, just have like a big old framework that tries to exclude a bunch of potential arguments, but it is something that I would have available to you as a strategic choice, knowing that it's kind of an if you got time for it. If you feel pretty good, like, hey, I know what our AF is, it's kind of small, short and sweet, I don't have to spend a ton of time on certain aspects of it, then it's always a option you have available to you that, hey, at least makes the LOC work a little harder, even if you have zero real intention of going for it later on in the debate round. You've said that, and you because you've done so, that allows you to that takes up their time when they could be making offensive arguments against you. They have to spend all of that time just basically saying, no, we are allowed to make this argument. I think we should start talking about preempting logical strategies and see kind of how this all plays out, because a lot of times I think it's one thing to hear that that's the strategic choice you should be making, and another thing to actually see that in action. So let's say resolution. United States federal government should increase humanitarian aid to the Congo. That's going to be your resolution. What do people think might be a very common negative strategy against a plan like this?
Reduce humanitarian aid.
There's reduce. Did you have one?
After counter plan.
Actor counter plan?
Economic disadvantage.
Yeah. And the actor counter plan, they might just say humanitarian aid bad, correct? We don't need to change too much in order to answer that, because our advantage is going to be humanitarian aid good. So, I mean, so if you're prepared to have that debate, if that's their strategy. The actor counter plan is pretty common, though, right? Where you'll just see someone say, no, the African Union or Canada or a number of other countries or organizations should provide this. So, knowing that that is a very logical strategy that you are likely to see, what is the way in which we can try and structure our affirmative to avoid this?
We can have a lot of US specific links, and maybe an advantage that is based on US, I don't know, legitimacy or something like that.
Yeah. US specific links. And US specific advantage. So, because we know that the actor counter plan is going to be a very likely strategy, we know that our question is not, this is a good example. If our question was just, is plan a good idea, then humanitarian aid good might be all you would need in order to win the round, right? If the only thing that you have to do is win that your plan is a good idea, then if you win that humanitarian aid's good, you win the round, you don't need anything else. But that's not, remember what we were saying, that's not what the game is. The game is prove that your idea is better. So if the counterplan's coming into it, then we have to expand. We could have just answered this part of the resolution and won it. The counterplan makes us have to defend the USFG as the one doing it. So instead of just planning our affirmative as, here's a bunch of reasons why humanitarian aid is good, it is, here's a bunch of reasons why the United States federal government giving humanitarian aid is a good thing. So the US specific links / solvency args. So only the U.S. has the institutional capability necessary to provide aid in this region. Other people don't have the infrastructure or aid. An organization like USAID, which is so experienced and so trusted worldwide, that ability for the U.S. to do that means that we're going to solve, that only the U.S. is capable of providing the necessary aid. You will also, so that's a big one. If you've probably heard me talk at some point about how, if you've seen any of my lectures, because I rant about this a lot, that you'll often see a solvency deficit outweighs the net benefit to the counter plan, but that is the AF strategy at the end of, that they're going for at the end of the debate. So these are the type of things, the US specific links, if you're winning that solvency deficit, that, look, sure, Canada could give the same amount of aid, the same amount of money, they could do everything, only the US has the capability of being, only the US has the ability and the capability to provide the infrastructure and support for the effective delivery of that aid.
So you, like in that point, you're just saying like, even with the counterplan, the US is still the most efficient, right?
Yeah,
So
it's the best.
Yeah.
You know, the counterplan says we can give this aid, it doesn't say it's going to, you can't fiat that it's going to be delivered perfectly and everything's going to happen exactly as you would want. So we're going to say that the US is the one who's the best capable of doing so. Now, because of that, that's a solvency deficit you can run. Solvency deficit, people are used to considering solvency, that doesn't solve as much, to be defensive arguments, right? That's how people think of it. When you're in the affirmative, a solvency deficit arg to the counterplan is offense for you. That is offense that you're weighing in the round. It's a solvency differential that you're creating that you're able to then weigh against the other team. So it's an incredibly valuable thing. U.S.-specific advantages. Oftentimes, you will see something along the lines of, you know, in the United States, soft power or something, that we need the ability to improve diplomatic relations, which are low because people think we don't care about human rights anymore. Plan shows that we care about human rights by giving humanitarian aid and are willing to do all these things. And because we do this, it has some beneficial aspect. That is something that no matter, even if they're winning the solvency debate, hell, even if they are winning, they might solve better. That Canada might be better at it than the U.S. is. There's no way that Canada giving aid is going to solve the U.S.'s soft power problems, right? Not going to happen. There's zero chance that the counter plan will effectively access this advantage in any way. So that's a guaranteed piece of potential offense for you that you're going to have at the end of the round. And a lot of times these arguments, I think people have a tendency to, I want to make the best argument and the most correct argument at all times. And this is probably a perfect example of why the most correct argument is not the most strategic argument. Because a lot of times this advantage, there might be something that's actually much more specific about the why plan is a good idea and why it's necessary and why it will help people more. Maybe it would be a better, truer argument to spend a bunch of time talking about humanitarian aid and why that's necessary and important thing. But that, even though that might be a better and a truer argument, it is not a more strategic argument in the sense of the debate round, because of, it's not just what is the argument, but it's what is the strategic function of the argument. And the strategic function of this argument is significantly more important than that, especially when they're running a counter plan that would, I mean, if they're running that counter plan, then this argument is absolutely necessary. Even if you don't think it's true and say, oh, but I like this advantage a lot more, if the counter plan has a pretty good chance of solving it, this one would be the more strategic one. And so I think that is the easiest way to, and kind of the, in my mind, the clearest example of how you preempt the logical strategies, because on topics like aid, so many of them have counter plans, and almost all of them will be an actor counter plan. I'd say any time resolution like this, there's a better than 50 to 60% chance, not that you'll be debating a counter plan, but that you'll be debating a counter plan that attempts to do the exact same thing as the AF, just with a different actor doing it. And so that happens so often, it's a clear mechanism of how you're able to preempt, yeah.
What if they run pick? Because then if they run pick, don't they have access to specific advantages?
They do, and that's why, let's do another thing about how we would preempt potential strategies. So let's say that they have a pick, that there's one type of aid that they're going to be saying is bad, or if there's one part of the Congo that we shouldn't go to, or whatever it is, that there's something that you shouldn't do. Anyone have ideas about how we could preempt with that? We could definitely do a theory preempt if we wanted. What argument can we make non-theory related? Generally, these arguments fall into the camp of complete action is key. Either we need the full scale, so in this instance, we might have...
Why all of the aid is important to all of the Congo.
Yes. So in this example, we might be saying, look, it could be an argument that USAID has a tried and true ability to, and a respected ability to deliver aid internationally. They're the most respected aid organization out there. The reason they're so respected is because they have their a comprehensive, not necessarily uniform, but they have a comprehensive type strategy that allows them to deliberate effectively in different spaces. If we're picking and choosing different, and so that's an argument that you can just say in the PMC, we have this comprehensive aid strategy that's very beneficial, very good. It doesn't sound like it's obviously preempting anything, but then they run the pick, and the MG gets to say, extend that number two solvency argument we make about the comprehensive nature of USAID's aid giving and aid packages and delivery, and how that's necessary for international faith in the mission. And so we're taking away the normal tried and true method that we normally have, and we're changing it up, and people are going to say, wait, why are we changing this? And it decreases that effectiveness. So that would be an option that we would have available to us.
So, I don't know how far you would take that, but it's almost like you're spiking in for a DA on a pick. Like, if you're preempting it, they're like, they dropped this is what it means.
Yeah, I mean, that is, a solvency deficit is a disadd to the counter plan, when you think of it that way. And so the solvency deficit in that instance is the entirety of, you'll see a long time, if the plan is to ban something and there is a pick that is ban that, all of that, except for this one specific thing within the broader thing that the AF is banning. Then, if that's the case, you will often see a complete rejection key or complete ban key in order to prevent any chance that it might reassert itself if you're allowing for exceptions here or there. So that's a very common preempt that you will see against a plan-inclusive counterplan that picks out of a specific part is complete rejection is key or complete action is key in order to get all of the solvency.
Do you like that better than just picking out as the act? So, like, just beat them to the punch. Just pick out one small part of aid that's necessary to that region and your thing goes.
I think that a lot of it depends on the resolution, and if the resolution gives, you should have an AF that is as tailored and specific as possible while still being topical. So, if your AF is about one type of aid to one area in the Congo that really needs it, and this is the resolution, it doesn't tell you what type of aid, it doesn't tell you that you have to do it to all of the Congo, it doesn't tell you much of anything. It just says, you've got to increase humanitarian aid to the Congo. So, in that instance where you have one specific type of aid in one region, you would say it would be a bad idea to have this as your plan text, because this is your plan text it seems like it's giving it to the entire Congo, and that might not be necessary. So you would say parametricize down to this is the specific aid that we're giving that will be delivered to this region. If a lot of times there will be a resolutional barrier to your attempting to do that. So if you want to get as specific as possible, but the resolution is such that it doesn't allow you to specify down that much, well, then you're screwed and you have to kind of play that pick game of preempting against the pick. So those are some pretty good examples. Those are the two most common types of counterplans you're going to see generally, I feel like, are the plan-inclusive counterplan in which you say, we're going to do the AF except for one small part. In that instance, it's complete action necessary, and reasons why not doing the entirety of the thing of the affirmative will result in the affirmative not solving at all. Even if you're only doing even if the counterplan does 99.9%, that 0.1% that might be switched out is enough to snowball and eventually becomes a huge deal as to why it wouldn't solve. That's your most common preempt against the actor counterplan. obviously there are several types of resolutions where an act or counter plan doesn't particularly make sense. If it's the USFG should pass this bill, that can only be done really, passing that bill can only be done through Congress. They could try a Supreme Court counterplan or something along those lines, but in the majority of instances, you're not going to be prepping against an act or counterplan in that scenario. So spending a bunch of time having that specific advantage might not be worthwhile to you. It might not be beneficial or a good idea. But so there's a process that you need to take of what's this type of resolution? What do you think we might see? What is the most common type of thing that might be coming against this, and augmenting and choosing your preempts effectively. I think there are also ways in which you can do this where you don't have to be preempting their counter plan. You're not going to say, well, I know this is going to be their counter plan, and preempt against it. Let's say you know it's going to be their disadvantage. We were talking earlier, I want to sit down again. We were talking earlier about the, if the resolution mandates regulation for environmental reasons. So your plan is some regulation on business to get them to stop polluting. You're guaranteed, in 99% of rounds in which you're doing that, there's going to be that pisses businesses off and it hurts the economy, right? That's going to be an argument in almost every one of those rounds. And so that's something that you know going in, and so spending a ton of time talking about why the environment is important and matters, that's a good thing and something you need to do, but it's not just you need to be setting up the comparison early on of why this regulation or something along those lines is more important than a potential economic consequence thereof. So what are a couple ways in which you might think that the environment is more important than the economy?
Entropy.
Meaning?
There's a finite amount of resources, so if we don't limit how much of that is used, then eventually it'll run out completely.
And so if resources run out, then we'll have what?
Complete catastrophic.
Probably wars for the dwindling resources, probably huge price spikes as resources dwindle. Maybe that huge price spike kills the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So and can be a very true argument that unless we massively increase our efficiency standards, we're going to keep using resources. This will result in scarcity. Scarcity causes high prices. If there's not a lot of it, it costs more. Obviously, that is the basics of economics. And so as there becomes less and less, it's going to cost more and more. So what you want to say is the environmental harms that are being talked about in the 1AC are going to make these economic impacts inevitable. Perfect. That's perfect way to potentially preempt it. I think there are also ways in which you can make an argument about something you'll often see very common on this is plan spurs the creation of a green technology industry or something along those lines, and that green tech is a extremely valuable industry that can be the driving force behind just like the tech industry drove a lot of the 1990s expansion, the computing industry, the green technology and green energy industry can be the thing that is driving the next economic expansion. So your argument is not just that you help the environment and why helping the environment is important, but in this instance, helping the environment creates a green technology industry, which is necessary. That investment is necessary to get us out of an economic recession. So Obviously, you can do this the other way too. Let's say that the resolution mandates that you have that you basically remove environmental regulations and you allow businesses to act more freely. You know you're probably going to be running a businesses are stoked advantage econ good. That's probably going to be your thing. So since you know that, you also know they're probably going to be environmental disadvantage. If you're removing environmental regulations and that's your affirmative, seems pretty obvious that they're going to have some disadvantage about that hurts the environment, which is a bad thing. Pretty obvious and standard. So what would be a reason why the economy might outweigh the environment or should be prioritized above?
Faster time frame in terms of impacts actually happening, environmental impacts, a lot of the time will just be like global warming, which is just, probably even if we hit the point of no return now, that's 50 years ahead of time, at least we can still survive in the meantime, whereas if we have these long protracted resource wars, we've probably all been nuked long before global warming kills us all.
I would say that's part of the way there, because that is the comparative analysis you might want to be making, in my mind, in the rebuttal. How would we preempt it? How would we...
Econ is key to green technology and that stuff.
Exact. That a strong functioning economy is key to the investment in green technology, which allows us to solve the environmental issues they're going to be talking about on their disad. Their environment will always be a problem. That's inevitable unless there is a green technology industry that is booming and thriving, which will allow us to counteract that. Only through plan which prevents an economic collapse from occurring can we direct funding to this, which will allow us to solve the energy crisis and create clean energy and solve global warming. So it's basically the PMC should probably be saying our argument solves their argument. You don't know what their argument's going to be yet. Sometimes you're going to predict, sometimes you're just going to have to predict. Occasionally you'll be wrong. Sometimes you'll do a lot of stuff preempting this and they'll run a K that you weren't. And it's like, okay, well you can still win that. That's fine. There's no, it doesn't hurt you. You just in the MG you answer more of the K stuff and you leave these preempts behind. There's not really a risk to them. There's only the potential that if they do the thing you think they're going to do, that it will be beneficial to you. So it's a little risk, high reward. Again, that's something that is just one of those questions you should always, it's a two-part question that you should be asking yourself is, what do I think their arguments are going to be? And B, how does our argument solve that argument? How does the economy solve the environment? How does Pakistan's stability that we're claiming on our Advantage 1, how does that solve the China disad, which is probably going to be, if we're doing something, if the plan does something related to China, then how is that going to be solved? It's if you're predicting that in the future, then it can only really be better for you. I think now we're going to talk a little bit about, just in general, I think a few strategic things that every PMC should keep in mind. In general, the goal, the questions that should be asked of each PMC in order to make them more strategic. You just sleeping in the front row, man? Yeah. I have been, and you know what? That was a wonderful throw on my part. That was right between those eyes, like right. That was great.
Subconscious memories.
What?
Subconscious
Yeah, just osmosis, like he'll be.
You see me, I'm an open mind.
So, probably the first general strategic thing to keep in mind, I would say, is to give yourself strategic flexibility. I think a perfect example of this, of a strategy that I personally would say you should try to avoid, but that you'll see a lot, is you get all of these, you get sometimes plans and affirmatives that will be kind of critical, but not not fully going, they'll just have, kind of have a critical advantage, but not really go all out and take the full step into being that way. The reason why this limits strategic flexibility is because, let's say that I watched a round yesterday that is fresh in my mind, so this will be the example we use. It was that NSA round. So something about reform the FISA court to increase personal privacy protections. So advantage 2 on it was, something about the panopticon. Like, Foucault, biopower, state control, all of these things. But, advantage 1 was something along the lines of, what? Advantage 1 was something, trying to bring it together. Basically, advantage 1 was we solved this conflict scenario that we're painting. So there's some war that's going to be happening that we solve, and there's this kind of break down the global surveillance regime that creates docile bodies and shit. So, Erwig, how does this potentially limit flexibility, strategic flexibility?
Well, if that's the only thing you're reading, you can't garner anything except for one broad, very overarching advantage.
Well, advantage 1 will be we stop this war. Advantage 2, the panopticon. What if they run biopower?
And you've just given them, you've just handed them the framework to weigh their critique against your net bends. And if you agreed with part of their K and they have all this framework, then there's really no reason to prefer you stopping the war.
Yeah, if you're making this argument about how biopower is the worst thing in the world, while still reading a topical plan text, the negative hasn't spoken yet. They haven't given their plan or what their advocacy text is going to be. They can probably create an advocacy text that in many ways addresses that problem more directly and better. And as long as they can come up with the reason, hey, maybe using the state as a means to dismantle state power is a good thing. And so now, often the most strategic argument that the affirmative can make against a critique is the impact term. I think that's the easiest thing to do, is saying, here's why the critique, what they're saying is bad, here's why it's good, right? That is the easiest way to get offense against a critique. You don't have that ability you can't be making an argument about, no, that surveillance regime is necessary and good if you're doing this advantage. It would contradict that. So now you're just determining who solves better for biopower, you or the alt, that because the alt does not have the requirement of being topical, it can probably jettison any part of the advocacy that might not solve perfectly and can only use the parts that would. And so the use of the state could often be a big problem in that. I think there are ways in which you can run these critical advantages, but you have to be going into it thinking the entire time that our goal is to be, you have to be prepared to win state action necessary to solve this critique, and that has to, you have, if they run a K, that has to be basically your argument is, we agree on pretty much everything else, but the affirmative or the permutation which uses the state will be better than without it, and just be willing to commit to that. So unless you're willing to spend a lot of that prep time devoted to state action necessary to break down biopower, unless you're going to do that, I don't see a strategic benefit in having this kind of semi-critical advantage, because it doesn't give, it's not something that's likely going to win you the round. If they go for a big disad, it's probably not gonna, this isn't fleshed out enough to really be able to weigh too much, because you don't have much of a framework or an evaluative arguments as to why it should be prioritized. So if they don't go that route, I think this advantage tends to fall by the wayside. If they do go that route, this advantage takes away your ability to impact turn the K, which is often very, very strategic.
You can also have some of those like state essential arguments, like not necessarily state good, you don't want to, but like you can have an argument you can bring to PMC about how like changing how power relations function on like a legal level has to come from the state.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are a lot of convincing arguments from Foucault about how like small reforms by the state are tactics by politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might as well, if you're reading these advantages, might as well start the state necessary in this instance to wait after the talk.
Yeah, exactly. It's, if you are going to be running this, to me it seems like that's what you're going to be trying to win the debate on, so what's the point of even having another different advantage that's, oftentimes you'll just see this as what's thrown on at the end. And advantage 2, we solve the panopticon. It's like we're trying to preempt the K, but I don't think it's a preemption that necessarily helps you strategically and can have a negative effect. Another thing to keep in mind is in terms of what you want strategically out of the PMC. Actually, this would take too long to explain, and we've only got 5 minutes. That was the important one anyway. So, any questions?